Imagine you are standing in the most powerful city on Earth. The year is 331 BC. The air smells of salt water, burning cedar, and something else. Something older. Something that doesn't have a name in any language you know. Around you, stone columns rise into a sky that seems too blue, too perfect, too alive. The sand beneath your feet is warm, warmer than it should be at this hour, and in the distance, across the Nile Delta, you can see it. A light, not the sun, not fire, something between the two. A young man on a white horse stops beside you. He is 25 years old. He has already conquered half the known world. His eyes are two different colors, one gray, one brown, and right now both of them are locked on that light. His name is Alexander, and in this moment he is not afraid of any army, any king, any god of Greece. But he is afraid of that light, because Alexander the Great, the man who wept when he thought there were no more worlds to conquer, has just realized something that will shatter everything he believed about gods, about power, and about the true age of the world. He has realized that the gods did not create humanity. The gods were here before humanity, waiting, and something in the desert just woke them up. This is not the history you were taught in school. This is the history that was buried, deliberately, carefully, strategically, beneath 40 feet of sand, beneath centuries of deliberately confused mythology, beneath the ruins of a library that someone burned down before its most dangerous scrolls could be read. Today, we are going to dig it all up. What you are about to hear is built on real archaeological discoveries, genuine mythological cross-references, and historical events that mainstream scholars have never been able to fully explain. We are going to connect those dots. We are going to follow the thread that leads from the mountaintops of ancient Greece all the way down into the deepest burial chambers of Egypt. And we are going to find something waiting at the bottom that neither civilization wanted you to know about. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will never look at ancient history the same way again. Let's start with a question that nobody in the academic world wants to answer directly. Why do the Greek gods and the Egyptian gods look so similar? Not just similar in a vague, general, all ancient religions share common themes kind of way. We're talking specific, precise, almost copy and paste similarities that go far beyond coincidence and far beyond cultural borrowing. Think about it. Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, is the lord of storms, lightning, the sky. He rules from a mountain. He is the father of heroes. He wages war against ancient primordial monsters called Titans. Now look at Amun-Ra, king of the Egyptian gods, lord of the sky. He travels the heavens daily in a great celestial vessel. He is the father of pharaohs, who are considered his divine children. And in the deepest, oldest versions of Egyptian myth, before even Amun-Ra becomes the dominant god, there is a time called the first occasion, Zep Tepi, when primordial beings of chaos threaten to unmake reality itself. Sound familiar? The Titans, the primordial chaos monsters, the divine king on his throne above the world, the father who creates heroes from unions with mortals. These are not similar religions that developed in parallel. These are two records of the same events, written in different languages, filtered through different cultural lenses, but pointing to the same original source. And that source, according to our story, according to the alternative history that the archaeology actually hints at, is something older than both civilizations combined. Let me take you back further, much further. Around 10,000 BC, roughly 12,000 years ago, The Earth looks completely different from the world we know. Sea levels are dramatically lower. Massive ice sheets still cover the northern continents. And in the region we now call the Eastern Mediterranean, modern Greece, Turkey, Egypt, the Levant, there are civilizations flourishing in places that we haven't found yet because they are now underwater. This is not fantasy. This is genuine scientific consensus. The Black Sea, for example, was once a freshwater lake surrounded by inhabited land. Around 5600 BC, the Mediterranean broke through and flooded it catastrophically. Thousands of square miles of inhabited coastline vanished beneath the water in what some researchers believe was the origin of the Noah's Ark story, and every similar flood myth from Mesopotamia to South America. But what was on that land before it flooded? What were those people doing? What did they know? And who, or what, were they in contact with? Here is where our story begins to diverge from the textbooks. In our alternative history, the world of 10,000 BC is a world where the barrier between the physical realm and what the ancients called the divine realm is thin, not metaphorically thin, physically thin, like a membrane that separates two vast bodies of water. On one side, the mortal world. On the other side, a dimension of pure consciousness, pure energy, pure thought, inhabited by beings of incomprehensible age and power. These beings, the beings that would eventually become what we call gods, are not supernatural in our story. They are natural. They are simply older. They evolved in their dimension long before human beings evolved in ours, and they have been watching us, studying us, in the way that biologists might study an interesting ecosystem for a very, very long time. But here's the thing about membranes. They don't stay thin forever. Around 10,000 BC, something happens that thickens the membrane dramatically. The divine beings, the proto-gods, as we'll call them, find themselves unable to cross over as easily as before. The pathways between realms begin to close. And the proto-gods, who have long enjoyed direct interaction with certain special groups of humans, the shamans, the priests, the wise ones, begin to realize they are running out of time. So they do something unprecedented. They choose sides. Some of the proto-gods align themselves with the people who will become the Greeks. Others align themselves with the people who will become the Egyptians. And in choosing sides, they also choose a strategy for maintaining their connection to the mortal world, because without that connection, without the worship, the prayer, the ritual energy that human beings generate, the proto-gods cannot maintain their physical forms in our dimension at all. They need us, and we needed them. This mutual dependency is the secret at the heart of everything. The reason the Greek and Egyptian mythologies look so similar is not because humans independently invented similar stories. It is because both mythologies are garbled, culturally filtered records of real encounters with the same original group of beings, the proto-gods who split into two factions and attached themselves to two of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. The Greeks got half of them, the Egyptians got the other half, and for thousands of years this arrangement worked beautifully. The proto-gods who became the Greek pantheon, Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, and the rest, maintained their power through a network of sacred sites scattered across the Greek world. The oracle at Delphi, the sanctuary at Olympia, the temple of Poseidon at Cape Sunion. These were not just religious centers. In our alternative history, they were power nodes, places where the membrane between realms was thin enough to allow a flow of energy from the divine dimension into the mortal world. The proto-gods who became the Egyptian pantheon operated differently. The Egyptians built permanent structures, massive, mathematically precise, energetically active structures. Temples along the Nile aligned to celestial events, underground chambers carved into the bedrock, and, most famously, the pyramids of Giza, structures so precisely engineered that modern architects still cannot fully explain how they were built. In our story, the reason they can't explain it is simple. The pyramids were not built by human beings alone. They were built with divine assistance, using principles of sacred geometry that manipulate the flow of energy between realms. They are not tombs. They never were tombs. They are machines, or more precisely, they are anchors, massive physical anchors that keep the Egyptian gods tethered to the mortal world even as the membrane between realms continues to thicken. The Greeks have their sacred sites, the Egyptians have their pyramids, and for thousands of years both civilizations flourish in the protective shadow of their divine patrons. But this equilibrium is fragile. Because the membrane keeps thickening, the gods keep growing weaker in the mortal realm. And something else, something that neither the Greeks nor the Egyptians had anticipated, is beginning to stir in the oldest, darkest corners of both mythologies. The Titans were not defeated. They were contained, and the containment is starting to fail. Here is something that most people don't know about the Titans. In the standard Greek mythology version of the story, Zeus defeats the Titans in a war called the Titanomachy, 10 years of apocalyptic conflict that shakes the cosmos, and then imprisons them in Tartarus, which is described as the deepest, darkest part of the underworld. Below Hades, below everything. But here's the detail that gets glossed over in almost every popular retelling. Tartarus is not a prison Zeus built. Tartarus existed before Zeus, before the Titans, before the Olympian gods entirely. Tartarus is described in the earliest Greek texts, Hesiod's Theogony, for example, as one of the first primordial entities to exist. Right alongside Chaos and Gaia, Tartarus was already there, already waiting, already containing something, and the Titans, when Zeus defeats them, aren't actually destroyed. They're pushed down into Tartarus, which means they're pushed into whatever was already in there. They become part of it, mixed into it, like dye dissolving into black water. Now look at the Egyptian equivalent. In Egyptian mythology, the great enemy of the gods is Apophis, also written as Apep. Apophis is a serpent of cosmic proportions, a creature of pure chaos, pure dissolution, pure anti-reality. Every single night, according to Egyptian belief, the sun god Ra travels through the underworld on his nightly journey, and every single night he must fight Apophis, who tries to devour the sun and plunge the world into eternal darkness. Apophis is never killed. Every night Ra defeats him temporarily. Every morning the sun rises because Ra has won another battle. But Apophis always comes back, always regenerates, always tries again. Why can't Apophis be destroyed permanently? Standard Egyptology says this is just a metaphor. The sun rises every morning. That's Ra winning. Night falls. That's Apophis temporarily gaining strength. It's a natural cycle expressed through mythological narrative. But our alternative history asks a different question. What if it's not a metaphor? What if Apophis can't be permanently destroyed because it is not a creature in the conventional sense, but a fundamental force, an anti-reality principle that exists at the deepest level of existence? And what if Tartarus, the bottomless pit of Greek mythology, and the underworld that Apophis inhabits in Egyptian mythology are the same place. Not similar places, the same place, seen from two different angles, described in two different languages, but the same dimensional space. This changes everything, because if the Greek Titans were imprisoned in the same dimensional space as the Egyptian Apophis, if the war that Zeus fought and the nightly battle that Ra fought were both battles against the same ultimate darkness, then the proto-gods of both civilizations weren't just similar beings who happened to inhabit the same planet. They were fighting the same war, and they had been fighting it since before human civilization existed. Let me give you some specific mythological details that support this reading. In Greek mythology, there is a creature called Typhon. Typhon is described as the most terrible monster that Zeus ever faced, more dangerous than the Titans themselves. Typhon has 100 serpent heads, voices like every animal that has ever existed, and the lower body of a coiling serpent. When he appears, the Olympian gods are so terrified that they flee to Egypt and hide there, disguising themselves as animals. Stop right there. The Greek gods, when frightened, flee to Egypt and hide as animals. What is the most distinctive visual feature of Egyptian gods? They have animal heads. Horus has a falcon head. Anubis has a jackal head. Thoth has an ibis head. Sekhmet has a lion head. The standard explanation is that these are separate mythological traditions that had no connection to each other until the Hellenistic period, when Greeks and Egyptians began to interact more closely. But our story offers a different explanation. What if the Greek gods did flee to Egypt? What if they did disguise themselves as the animals that became the visual shorthand for Egyptian deities? What if the Egyptian gods with animal heads are, in part, a record of the time when the Olympians took refuge in the Nile Valley, and the Egyptians, seeing these divine beings wearing animal forms they'd chosen for camouflage, incorporated those forms into their religious iconography? It would mean that Greek and Egyptian mythology are not parallel traditions. They are sequential records of the same ongoing story, the story of divine beings trying to maintain their foothold in the mortal world while fighting an ancient, unkillable enemy from below. And here's where it gets really interesting. Both mythologies describe this enemy using the same imagery: serpents, coiling, endless, world-encompassing serpents. In Greece, Typhon, the great serpent monster; the Hydra, with its regenerating heads; Python, the great serpent of Delphi that Apollo killed, or so the story goes. In Egypt, Apophis, the eternal chaos serpent; the Uraeus, the sacred cobra worn on the pharaoh's crown, which is not a symbol of the king's power, but a symbol of the tamed serpent energy, controlled and directed rather than wild. Both civilizations are obsessed with serpents. Both civilizations describe their primary cosmic enemy as a serpent, and both civilizations place enormous importance on the idea that this serpent cannot be permanently killed, only temporarily suppressed. In our alternative history, here is the truth behind this imagery. The great enemy, the thing in Tartarus, the thing that Apophis represents, is not a physical serpent at all. It is a category of being, a type of consciousness that predates the proto-gods, predates the mortal world, predates perhaps everything we understand as reality. It is pure entropy, pure dissolution, pure anti-structure, and it takes a serpentine form in visions because the human mind, confronted with something it cannot categorize, defaults to the most ancient fear trigger in our evolutionary history. Snakes. We are hardwired to fear snakes. It is one of the oldest fears in the primate brain, older than language, older than memory, older than rational thought. And the proto-gods, who can perceive this ancient enemy directly, somehow transmit the image of its nature to the human priests and prophets who receive their divine visions. And those priests and prophets encode it as a serpent, because a serpent is the closest thing in human experience to the raw fear that this entity generates. But here is what matters for our story. Around the 4th century BC, around the time of Alexander the Great, both factions of proto-gods, the Greek Olympians and the Egyptian pantheon, are reporting the same alarming development to their most trusted mortal servants. The containment is weakening. The ancient enemy, the entity at the bottom of both mythological traditions, is beginning to move again after thousands of years of stillness. And neither group of gods has enough power left in the mortal realm to fight it alone. They need each other. But there is a problem. After thousands of years of separate development, the Greek and Egyptian factions of proto-gods have become genuinely distinct beings. They still share a common origin, but their personalities, their values, their ways of interacting with humanity, these have diverged significantly, and their mortal followers, the Greeks and the Egyptians, regard each other with deep suspicion, if not outright contempt. Uniting the two divine factions requires uniting the two mortal civilizations first. And the only human being alive in 331 BC who might be capable of doing that is a young Macedonian king who just crossed the Hellespont with 50,000 soldiers and a burning ambition to see every corner of the world. Alexander. Let me tell you the things about Alexander the Great that the history textbooks mention but don't fully explain. His mother, Olympus, was one of the most intensely religious women in the ancient world. She was a devotee of the mystery cults, specifically the Dionysian mysteries, which were ecstatic, secretive rituals involving trance states, communion with divine beings, and the receipt of direct divine knowledge. She kept live snakes in her bedchamber as sacred animals, which terrified even her husband Philip II. Olympus told Alexander from his earliest childhood that his real father was not Philip at all. His real father, she told him, was Zeus Amun, a syncretic deity that combined the Greek Zeus with the Egyptian Amun, worshipped at a famous oracle in the Libyan desert at a place called Siwa. Alexander grew up believing, genuinely believing, that he was the son of a god. Now, standard historical analysis says this is political propaganda. Olympus was promoting a useful myth to elevate her son's status. The Alexander as son of Zeus narrative is understood as a shrewd piece of ancient spin doctoring. But consider the details that don't fit that clean explanation. When Alexander was born, multiple ancient sources record that lightning struck the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burning it to the ground. The Magi at Ephesus were reportedly running through the streets crying that a great catastrophe had been born that day, a force that would unmake the existing order of the world. Ancient sources also record that elephants in the Persian royal stables knelt down that night without being commanded to. These are the kinds of details that historians dismiss as later hagiography, stories added after the fact to make a great man seem predestined for greatness. And maybe they are, but maybe there's something else. Maybe they're the record of divine intervention, the mark of the proto-gods choosing their instrument. In our alternative history, Alexander is not the biological son of Zeus, but he is something arguably more significant. He is the mortal human being who was specifically selected, from birth, by a coalition of both divine factions, Greek and Egyptian, to be the one who unites them. The oracle at Delphi, one of the most powerful nodes of Greek divine energy, told him he was invincible before his first major campaign. Notably, the Pythia, the oracle's human voice, apparently gave him this declaration unprompted before he even asked a question. The priests were baffled. In our story, they weren't baffled. They knew exactly what was happening. The god Apollo, speaking through the Pythia, was fulfilling his part of an arrangement that had been made long before Alexander was born. The Egyptian half of the plan was executed at the oracle of Siwa. In 331 BC, in the middle of his Egyptian campaign, Alexander did something that seemed tactically insane. He left his army and marched west into the Libyan desert, hundreds of miles from any military objective, to visit the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis. The journey nearly killed him and his companions. They got lost in sandstorms. They ran low on water. By every rational military calculation, it was a pointless and dangerous detour. He went anyway. Ancient sources tell us that when Alexander arrived at Siwa and entered the inner sanctuary of the temple, the high priest came out to meet him and, before Alexander had said a single word, greeted him as son of Amun, which was the traditional greeting for the pharaoh of Egypt. Alexander was not yet officially proclaimed pharaoh. He had barely arrived in Egypt. The priest had no political reason to grant him this title preemptively. What happened inside the inner sanctuary, Alexander never told anyone, not his generals, not his closest friends, not even his historian Callisthenes, who was traveling with the army and recorded everything. He emerged from the sanctuary visibly changed. Multiple sources note that he seemed different afterward, calmer, more certain, as if some fundamental question about his existence had been answered. When his companions asked what the oracle had told him, he said only that he had received what he desired. In our alternative history, here is what happened inside the sanctuary at Siwa. Alexander met the Egyptian gods, not a vision, not a spiritual experience in the metaphorical sense. He met them, or rather, he met the mortal priests who had been specifically prepared for decades to serve as vessels for divine communication. And through those priests, the Egyptian pantheon, specifically Amun-Ra, Thoth, the god of wisdom, and Sekhmet, the goddess of destruction, told Alexander the truth. They told him about the ancient enemy stirring beneath the world. They told him about the Greek and Egyptian divine factions and their common origin. They told him what he needed to do: build a city, the greatest city in the history of the world. Build it at the mouth of the Nile, at the precise geographical coordinates where the membrane between realms is thinnest in the eastern Mediterranean. Build it as a meeting point, not just for Greeks and Egyptians, but for the two divine factions who need to merge their remaining power before the ancient enemy breaks free. Alexander left Siwa and immediately ordered the founding of a new city on the Egyptian coast. He personally walked the perimeter of the proposed city, scattering grain to mark the boundaries, a traditional Macedonian practice that, notably, is also a ritual procedure in Egyptian temple founding ceremonies. The city was, of course, Alexandria, and it was not built to be a great commercial or political center, though it became both those things. It was built to be something else entirely. It was built to be a divine convergence point, a place where two sets of gods, two mythological traditions, and two civilizations could come together in the thin air between their worlds and prepare for the war that was coming. Alexandria, Egypt. At its height, it was the largest city in the world. Population estimates range up to 1 million people, an almost incomprehensible number for the ancient world, when Rome itself had perhaps 500,000. It was a city of staggering architectural ambition, extraordinary intellectual achievement, and peculiar spiritual intensity. The Library of Alexandria, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Mouseion, which was the ancient world's closest equivalent to a modern research university. The Serapeum, a vast underground complex dedicated to the god Serapis, a deity who did not exist before Alexandria and was specifically created to serve as a divine bridge between Greek and Egyptian religion. Let's talk about Serapis for a moment, because Serapis is one of the strangest and most fascinating figures in ancient religious history, and in our story he is absolutely central to everything. Serapis was created, deliberately, by a committee, essentially. During the reign of Ptolemy I, Alexander's general who became king of Egypt after Alexander's death, a syncretic cult was established in Alexandria around a new god who combined elements of the Greek Zeus, Hades, and Dionysus with the Egyptian Osiris and Apis, the sacred bull. Serapis wore a grain basket on his head, symbol of agricultural abundance, and was associated with the sun, with the underworld, with healing, and with cosmic order. The standard historical explanation for Serapis's creation is straightforward. Ptolemy I needed a deity that both his Greek and his Egyptian subjects could worship together to promote political unity. Creating a new syncretic god was a clever piece of political engineering, and that explanation is perfectly adequate on its face. But our story asks, why did it work so well? Why did a deliberately manufactured deity, a god created by political committee, achieve such extraordinary, genuine religious power? Why did the cult of Serapis spread across the Mediterranean world with a fervor that purely political religions rarely generate? Why were people having genuine spiritual experiences in the Serapeum? Why did the healings associated with Serapis's cult have the kind of testimonial evidence that suggests something real was happening, not just pious wishful thinking? In our alternative history, the answer is this. Serapis was not entirely manufactured. The political committee chose a combination of divine attributes, yes. But in doing so, they accidentally, or were guided to, construct a vessel that corresponded to a real divine entity, an entity that had existed in the space between the Greek and Egyptian divine factions for thousands of years, an entity that was, in a sense, the hybrid child of both pantheons, the point where they overlapped, the frequency at which both groups of proto-gods could simultaneously resonate. When the priests of the Serapeum performed their rituals, they were not calling on a political fiction. They were calling on something genuine, something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of invitation, a deliberate merging of both mythological vocabularies into a single coherent ritual language. The Serapeum in Alexandria was not just a temple. In our story, it was the primary convergence node that Alexander had been ordered to create, the physical structure that anchored the merging of both divine factions. the place where the membrane between realms was thinnest in the entire Mediterranean world. And underneath the Serapeum, in the vast underground network of tunnels, chambers, and passages that archaeologists have confirmed actually exist beneath modern Alexandria, something was stored. The Library of Alexandria is always discussed in terms of its books, and yes, the library contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the collected knowledge of the ancient world, the works of Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and hundreds of others whose names are now lost. When the library was destroyed, partially under Julius Caesar, more substantially under Aurelian, and finally under Theophilus in 391 A.D., the loss of that knowledge set back human civilization by incalculable amounts. Some historians estimate it delayed the Industrial Revolution by 500 years. But our story says the most important things in the library were not the books about mathematics and astronomy and literature. The most important things were the original records, the documents that predated Greek civilization and Egyptian civilization both. The records that had been maintained, copied, and recopied for thousands of years by the priest-scribes of both traditions, the records that documented the true nature of the proto-gods, their origin, their relationship with humanity, the nature of the ancient enemy, and the protocols for the Great Convergence. These documents are what the library was actually built to house. Everything else, the scientific treatises, the philosophical works, the poetry and history, all of that was real and valuable and genuinely catastrophic to lose. But it was also, in a sense, camouflage, a vast collection of ordinary knowledge designed to obscure the extraordinary knowledge at its heart. And when the library burned, the most dangerous scrolls did not burn with it. They had been moved, decades before the first fire, quietly at night, by priests who knew what was coming. They were moved underground, into the tunnels beneath the Serapeum, into chambers that have still not been fully excavated, in a city where the water table makes deep archaeological investigation extraordinarily difficult. They may still be there. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we follow the scrolls into the underground, we need to talk about what happened to Alexander, and why his death, far from being the end of the divine convergence project, was actually the moment it truly began. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 B.C. He was 32 years old. He died of fever, most likely, or possibly of typhoid complicated by heavy alcohol consumption, or possibly of poisoning. The ancient sources are divided, and the debate has never been definitively resolved. What is not disputed is that he died suddenly, without naming a successor, and that his death immediately triggered one of the most catastrophic political fragmentations in ancient history. His generals, the Diadochi, they're called, the successors, immediately began fighting over the empire he had built. Within 20 years of his death, the empire was shattered into multiple competing kingdoms: the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Persia and the Near East, the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedonia and Greece, dozens of smaller states carved out of the margins. From a purely political standpoint, this fragmentation is tragic, but comprehensible. Alexander died young, left no viable heir, and the men who served him were extraordinary military commanders with enormous personal ambitions. The empire breaking apart was almost inevitable. But our story notices something that the standard political analysis misses: When Alexander's empire fractured, the divine convergence project fractured with it. Think about what Alexandria was supposed to be, the meeting point of two divine factions, the city where Greek and Egyptian sacred traditions would merge, creating a unified spiritual power capable of confronting the ancient enemy. For that project to work, Alexandria needed to be the center of a unified civilization, a world city at the heart of a world empire. Instead, within a generation of Alexander's death, Alexandria is the capital of just one of several competing kingdoms. The Ptolemaic dynasty rules Egypt, certainly, and they are, to their credit, genuinely committed to the cultural and intellectual project of Alexandria. They fund the library. They build the Mouseion. They promote the cult of Serapis. They do everything they were presumably told to do. But the Greek homeland, Macedonia, Athens, Corinth, Sparta, is under different rulers. The Persian territories are under different rulers, and crucially, the sacred sites of Greece, Delphi, Olympia, the great temples, are now separated from Alexandria by political boundaries, competing military powers, and a steadily growing cultural and economic rivalry. The two halves of the divine convergence, the Greek sacred sites and the Egyptian convergence node at Alexandria, are being pulled apart instead of coming together. In our story, this is a crisis at the divine level that mirrors the crisis at the human level. The Greek proto-gods, their sacred sites scattered across a politically fragmented world, begin to lose power more rapidly. The great oracles, Delphi especially, begin to give increasingly vague and unreliable prophecies. The myth-making that keeps the gods present and vital in the mortal realm begins to dry up. The old stories are still told, but they feel increasingly like history rather than living reality. The Egyptian proto-gods, anchored more firmly by their physical structures, the pyramids, the great temples at Karnak and Luxor, the Serapeum, maintain their power longer. But without the Greek faction's energy to complement theirs, they are also weakening. The vast reservoir of divine power that should have been created by the merging of both traditions never fully materializes. And underground, in the space below both mythological traditions, in the dimensional equivalent of Tartarus and the Egyptian underworld, the ancient enemy stirs more purposefully. Now, here is the alternative history pivot point that changes everything. In standard history, Alexander dies. His empire breaks apart. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerge from the fragments are culturally remarkable, but politically unstable. They gradually fall one by one to the new rising power of Rome, a civilization that absorbs Greek culture enthusiastically but develops its own relationship with divinity, its own mythological tradition, its own gods who are, notably, almost identical to the Greek ones with Latin names. In our alternative history, something different happens at the moment of Alexander's death. Alexander does not die entirely. His body dies. The fever takes him. He breathes his last in the palace at Babylon. All of that is exactly as recorded. But the person, the consciousness, the entity that Alexander had become through decades of divine preparation and his experiences at Siwa and Delphi and 100 other sacred places, that does not simply dissolve. The proto-gods intervene. There is a concept in ancient Egyptian religion called the Ba, often translated as the soul, but more accurately understood as the personality or essential self. The Ba is separate from the body and continues to exist after death, though it needs the preserved body, the mummy, as an anchor in the mortal world. This is why mummification was so important in Egyptian culture. It wasn't merely about physical preservation, it was about maintaining the Bia's connection to the mortal realm. Alexander's body was mummified. This is historical fact. Ancient sources describe his body as being preserved in honey, a known ancient preservation technique, and displayed in a glass sarcophagus. In Alexandria, a magnificent tomb was built for him, called the Soma, or the Sema, and Alexander's mummy was placed in it. For centuries, it was one of the most famous sights in the ancient world. Julius Caesar visited it. Augustus Caesar visited it and reportedly accidentally knocked Alexander's nose off when leaning in too close. Then, around the 4th century A.D., the tomb disappears from the historical record entirely. Nobody knows what happened to Alexander's body. It is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The tomb is somewhere under modern Alexandria. Archaeologists have been searching for it for decades, without success. In our alternative history, we know exactly what happened. The mummy was not lost. It was not accidentally destroyed. It was moved by the same priests who moved the most dangerous scrolls from the library into the same underground chambers beneath the Serapeum, because Alexander's preserved body was not just a historical artifact, it was an anchor, an Egyptian-style divine anchor for the consciousness of the one mortal being who understood both divine traditions from the inside. Alexander, in death, became something the proto-gods had been trying to create for centuries: a bridge, a translator, a being who existed simultaneously in the mortal realm, anchored by his mummified body, and in the divine dimension, his consciousness preserved and empowered by his death rather than diminished by it. He became, in our story, the first truly syncretic divine being, neither fully Greek nor fully Egyptian, neither fully mortal nor fully divine. A new category of being created by the collision of two ancient traditions and the catastrophic circumstances of his death. The proto-gods had lost their living instrument, but they had gained something more powerful. They had gained a mediator who could speak to both factions from a position of genuine authority. Now the question was, did they have enough time to finish what Alexander had started before the ancient enemy broke free? For 300 years after Alexander's death, Alexandria was the most intellectually extraordinary city that had ever existed. This is not alternative history. This is simply history. The library contained, at its peak, somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. To put that in perspective, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453 A.D., almost 2,000 years after the library's founding, the largest libraries in Western Europe contained perhaps a few thousand volumes. The Library of Alexandria was a concentration of human knowledge without parallel in the ancient world, and arguably without parallel until the development of the modern research university in the 19th century. But what was it for? Why did the Ptolemaic kings invest so enormously in this institution? Standard history says prestige and soft power. Alexandria was positioning itself as the cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. The library was an instrument of Ptolemaic geopolitical ambition, a way of saying to the world, all roads of knowledge lead here. That's true, but in our alternative history, it's only part of the truth. The library, the Mouseion, and the Serapeum together formed a structure that served as the operational headquarters of what we might call the Mystery Network, a loose but deliberately maintained organization of priests, philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians who all shared one fundamental characteristic. They knew the truth. Not all of them knew all of it. The network was organized in concentric circles of initiation, like the mystery cults that Olympus had been part of, like the Eleusinian mysteries that were one of the great secrets of the Greek world. Outer circles knew only that there was a sacred dimension to their work. Inner circles knew more. And at the very center, the innermost circle of what we might call the Alexandrian mysteries, there were perhaps a dozen individuals in any given generation who knew the full picture. Who knew about the proto-gods and their common origin? Who knew about the ancient enemy? Who knew about Alexander's preserved consciousness in the underground chambers? Who knew that the Convergence Project was ongoing and that their work, their seemingly ordinary scholarly and scientific work, was actually part of that project? Let me give you some examples. Eratosthenes, the librarian of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, the man who calculated the circumference of the earth with stunning accuracy, using only shadows and geometry. He placed his measurement sticks at Syene, modern Aswan, and at Alexandria simultaneously on the summer solstice, measured the difference in shadow angles, and calculated the Earth's circumference to within a few hundred miles of the correct modern measurement. This is presented in history textbooks as a brilliant example of pure scientific reasoning. And it is. But why was Eratosthenes so interested in the precise geometry of the Earth? Why did his work also include extensive mapping of the known world, including careful notation of the locations of the most ancient sacred sites? Why does his catalog of star positions align so precisely with the astronomical orientations of the great Egyptian temples? In our story, Eratosthenes was a middle circle initiate. He knew that the sacred geometry of the Earth, the patterns of ley lines, power nodes, and thin membrane locations needed to be precisely mapped, because as the ancient enemy grew stronger, the divine Convergence Project needed to be expanded. New nodes needed to be identified and activated. The convergence could not remain centered on Alexandria alone. It needed to become a global network. Eratosthenes was mapping the expansion of the divine grid. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working slightly later, built on Eratosthenes' astronomical work and created the first star catalog in history, listing over 850 stars with their positions recorded to a precision that modern astronomers have verified as genuinely accurate. He also discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the apparent positions of stars to shift over a 26,000-year cycle. The precession of the equinoxes. Let that sink in for a moment. The ancient Egyptians built their temples with astronomical alignments that account for this precession. The Sphinx at Giza, according to alternative archaeology scholars like Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, is oriented toward a sky configuration that only existed around 10,500 BC, precisely the era we identified in Block 1 as the period when the membrane between realms was thinning and the proto-gods were choosing their mortal allies. Hipparchus, in discovering the precession, may have been working from older Egyptian records that the library housed and that an initiate of his level would have had access to. He was not just doing astronomy. He was recovering ancient knowledge about the timeline of the divine war, understanding how the cosmic cycles affected the membrane between realms, and therefore when the ancient enemy would be at its strongest. The precessional cycle is 26,000 years. According to our alternative history's cosmological model, the membrane between realms thins and thickens over this cycle. At certain precessional positions, the gods can walk among us. At others, they can barely maintain contact. The ancient enemy is most dangerous when the membrane is thinnest, because that is when it can most easily break through. The mystery school scholars of Alexandria were calculating exactly when the next critical window would open. Their calculations pointed to a period several centuries in the future, roughly 300 to 400 AD. That is exactly when Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and began the process of dismantling the pagan temple network across the empire. That is exactly when the Serapeum was destroyed and the library was finally obliterated. That is exactly when the entire infrastructure of the Divine Convergence Project was systematically dismantled. Coincidence? Our story says no. Our story says that whoever, or whatever, was directing the forces opposed to the Convergence Project knew about the precessional window too, and they spent the centuries between Alexandria's founding and the Christian takeover of Rome systematically infiltrating and undermining the Mystery Network's infrastructure, not through supernatural intervention, through human beings. The ancient enemy does not need to act directly in the mortal world. It has something far more efficient than direct action. It has the single most powerful force in human psychology: fear. The ancient enemy, the primordial chaos force that both Greek and Egyptian mythology encoded as the serpent of dissolution, does not have hands. It cannot pick up a sword or write an edict or command an army. It cannot, in any direct sense, act in the mortal world. But it can whisper, not in words, not in language, in something more fundamental than language, in the frequency of fear, specifically the fear of the unknown, the fear of the other, the fear of anything that challenges a stable, predictable understanding of reality. Every human mind, at its deepest level, has access to this frequency. And most human minds, most of the time, in most circumstances, successfully resist it. The rational mind, the social mind, the curious and creative mind, these are all defenses against the frequency of dissolution. But the ancient enemy is patient. It does not need to overcome human rationality directly. It only needs to find the moments when human beings are most vulnerable, most afraid, most uncertain, most desperate for simple and absolute answers, and amplify what is already there. This is not a supernatural mechanism. This is simply the way that mass psychology works. Panic spreads. Mob mentality is real. The history of human civilization is full of moments when entire societies turned on their most valuable members, their wisest, most creative, most unconventional thinkers, out of collective fear. In our story, the ancient enemy has been gently, persistently amplifying this tendency throughout human history, not causing it, but using it, finding the moments when the conditions for destructive fear are already present and making them slightly worse, pushing already unstable situations slightly further toward catastrophe. Let me show you how this works in the specific historical context of our story. Rome. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, Rome is experiencing a cascading series of political, economic, and military crises. The Pax Romana, The long period of relative stability that had made the Roman Empire function is breaking down. There are military coups every few years. Economic inflation is devastating. Plague sweeps through repeatedly. The borders are under constant pressure. Ordinary Romans are terrified. Terrified people look for certainty, for absolute truth, for something that will explain why everything is falling apart and offer a clear path to safety. Mystery cults multiply. New religions emerge and spread with remarkable speed. The cult of Mithras, a soldier's religion with deep roots in Persian mythology, sweeps through the Roman legions. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess whose worship had spread throughout the Mediterranean in the Hellenistic period, attracts millions of devotees. And a new religion originating in the eastern province of Judea, based on the teachings of a Jewish teacher executed under Pontius Pilate around 30 A.D., begins to grow with extraordinary speed. Christianity. I need to say something carefully here. Our story is not anti-Christian. The profound moral and spiritual insights of the Christian tradition, the emphasis on love, forgiveness, the dignity of every human person, these are real and valuable. Nothing in our alternative history dismisses or negates that. But our story does notice something about the timing and specific character of early Christianity's political triumph. Constantine's conversion in 312 A.D. and the subsequent establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire did not just change religious practice, it resulted in the deliberate, systematic destruction of the pagan sacred infrastructure, the temples, the oracles, the mystery schools, that formed the backbone of the Divine Convergence Project. In 391 A.D., Emperor Theodosius issued edicts ordering the destruction of all pagan temples throughout the empire. The Serapeum in Alexandria, the primary convergence node, was specifically targeted. Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria organized a Christian mob that attacked and destroyed the Serapeum. The library, or what remained of it by that point, was obliterated. Hypatia of Alexandria, the last great female philosopher of the classical world and very likely an inner circle initiate of the Alexandrian mysteries, was murdered by another Christian mob in 415 A.D. The Convergence Project's infrastructure, built over 3 centuries of patient effort, was dismantled in a few decades. Was this the ancient enemy's doing? In our story, yes, partly. Not by controlling Constantine or Theophilus like puppets, but by amplifying the fear, the certainty, the desperate need for absolute truth that was already present in a collapsing civilization. By making the threat of religious plurality, the "you cannot serve both gods" absolutism that characterized the political Christianity of the late Roman period, feel more urgent, more existential, more cosmically necessary than it actually was. The human beings who destroyed the Serapeum and murdered Hypatia believed they were doing the right thing. They were terrified people in a terrifying time, and they had been told, by their leaders, by their sacred texts, by everything they believed, that the old gods were demons, the old knowledge was heresy, and the old sacred sites were abominations. They were wrong, but they were not evil. They were, in the language of our story, instruments of the ancient enemy without knowing it. And this pattern, this use of human fear and certainty and violence to destroy the specific structures that the Convergence Project needed, is not unique to the Christian Roman period. Our story suggests it has recurred throughout history, every time the Convergence Project made significant progress. The destruction of the temples at Karnak by the monotheistic pharaoh Akhenaten around 1350 BC, just when Egyptian sacred tradition was reaching a new synthesis with Mediterranean mystery traditions. That's worth noting. The burning of the Persian royal library at Persepolis by Alexander himself, a moment that historians find puzzling given his general respect for learning. Was Alexander, in that moment, being used? Was the ancient enemy briefly gaining influence over its own instrument, pushing him to destroy records he shouldn't have destroyed? The murder of Archimedes by a Roman soldier during the sack of Syracuse in 212 BC, a man who, according to alternative readings of his fragmentary work, was close to breakthroughs in sacred geometry that would have advanced the Convergence project dramatically. Coincidences? Or a pattern? Our story sees a pattern, and our story suggests that the mystery network, the inner circle of the Alexandrian tradition, saw the pattern too, and responded, not by fighting, not by creating armies or political movements or counter-religions, by hiding. The most important scrolls went underground before the library burned. Alexander's mummy was moved before the Soma became politically sensitive. The initiated scholars scattered, carrying their knowledge into new forms, embedding it in new traditions, new texts, new artistic and architectural codes that the agents of dissolution would not recognize as dangerous. They became invisible, and in the centuries that followed, they waited. When people talk about the Dark Ages, the period roughly between the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD and the beginning of the Renaissance around 1300 to 1400 AD, they typically focus on loss. The loss of Roman administrative efficiency, the loss of classical learning, the loss of urban life, long-distance trade, sophisticated art, and architecture. What they talk about less is what survived, not in the major centers of power, Rome, Constantinople, the Frankish courts, but in the margins, the monasteries of Ireland, preserving classical manuscripts, the Islamic scholars of Baghdad, translating and extending Greek science and philosophy, the Jewish communities of the Mediterranean diaspora, maintaining esoteric traditions that preserved more of the ancient wisdom tradition than they are usually credited with. The Hermetic communities of Egypt and Syria, openly pagan long after paganism was officially illegal, quietly passing on knowledge through networks of initiates. In our alternative history, these are not separate phenomena. They are all parts of the same hidden stream, the mystery network, in its post-Alexandrian form, adapted for survival in a world that had become hostile to its core activities. Let me follow the thread. After the destruction of the Serapeum and the murder of Hypatia, the inner circle of the Alexandrian mysteries dispersed in three directions. One group went east, into Persia, where the Sassanid Empire was actively hostile to Christian Rome and consequently tolerated religious plurality far more. They established themselves within the Zoroastrian priestly tradition, the Magi, and began encoding the convergence knowledge in the highly sophisticated symbolic language of Zoroastrian cosmology. The Magi's cosmic dualism, the eternal war between Ahura Mazda, divine light and order, and Ahriman, darkness and chaos, was a perfect narrative container for the truth about the ancient enemy. Not identical to the Greek/Egyptian framework, but compatible, translatable, expandable. The second group went west, into the scattered communities of scholars and mystics who were trying to reconcile Platonic philosophy with the new religious landscape of Christian Rome. This group became the Hermetic tradition, Hermeticism, named for Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, a syncretic figure who blended the Greek Hermes with the Egyptian Thoth, is one of the most important and least understood currents in Western intellectual history. The Hermetic texts, the Corpus Hermeticum, are a collection of philosophical and mystical writings that clearly preserve elements of the Alexandrian knowledge tradition, encoded in forms that could survive in a Christian world. Thoth. Let's pause here. Thoth was the Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, magic, and cosmic balance. He was the divine scribe, the being who recorded the judgments of the dead, the keeper of divine knowledge, the one who maintained the cosmic order through the power of written words and spoken formulas. In our story, Thoth is one of the Egyptian proto-gods who was most deeply involved in the Convergence Project, and in the aftermath of Alexandria's destruction, his energy, his frequency, his divine influence is embedded particularly strongly in the Hermetic tradition that bears his syncretic name. When Hermetic philosophers in medieval Europe wrote about the divine intellect, when they described processes for refining the soul through stages of gnosis, when they spoke of the correspondence between the celestial realm and the terrestrial one in the famous formula as above, so below, they were working with knowledge that traced an unbroken line back to the inner sanctuary at Siwa, where Alexander first learned the truth. The third group went south, deeper into Egypt, into the desert monasteries that were becoming the incubators of Christian mysticism. This group had perhaps the most difficult task, preserving the convergence knowledge within a religious framework that was, at least in its official form, actively hostile to it. They did it through the apophatic tradition, the mystical strand of Christianity that emphasizes the unknowability of God, the limitations of language and concept in describing the divine, the experience of direct union with ultimate reality. This tradition, associated with figures like Origen and the Desert Fathers, and later with Meister Eckhart and the Cloud of Unknowing, was always in tension with official church doctrine precisely because it preserved too much of the pre-Christian understanding of the divine nature. In our story, this tension was deliberate. The mystics of the desert monasteries were not rogue Christian thinkers. They were inner circle initiates, maintaining the thread while wearing the protective coloring of the dominant religion. But all three of these hidden streams faced the same problem that the Alexandrian project had faced: fragmentation. The eastern stream, the western stream, and the southern stream all had pieces of the picture. None of them had the complete picture. The complete knowledge had been in Alexandria, in the innermost circle, in the chambers beneath the Serapeum, and since Alexander's time, that complete knowledge had only been held by a very small number of people simultaneously. As centuries passed and initiates died without fully passing on their knowledge, pieces were lost. Mistranslations crept in. Cultural filters changed the meaning of symbolic language. What had been a coherent, unified understanding of the divine convergence project began to fracture into dozens of partial traditions that knew they were all pointing at the same thing but could no longer clearly see what that thing was. And underground, in the dimension below the mortal world, the ancient enemy was slowly, inexorably growing stronger. But here is the thing about the mystery network, the thing that kept it alive through centuries of dispersal and suppression and partial knowledge. The proto-gods were still there, weakened, barely present in the mortal realm, but still there, and they were still trying to communicate in the dream visions of medieval mystics, in the mathematical intuitions of Islamic scholars discovering algebra and trigonometry, in the artistic inspirations of cathedral architects who built their great structures with proportional systems that directly echoed the sacred geometry of the Egyptian temples, in the alchemical experiments of Hermetic philosophers who were trying, using the language of chemistry and metallurgy, to describe processes of consciousness transformation that the Alexandrian initiates had understood directly. The gods were whispering, the stream was flowing, and slowly, painfully slowly, the scattered pieces of the convergence knowledge were beginning to find their way back toward each other. The Renaissance, when it came, was not a coincidence. Florence, 1463. Cosimo de' Medici, the most powerful banker in Europe, the de facto ruler of Florence, the most important patron of art and learning in the Western world, receives a shipment. It has come from Macedonia, from a monk named Leonardo of Pistoia, who Cosimo had specifically tasked with searching for ancient manuscripts throughout the Greek-speaking world. The shipment contains a collection of texts in Greek that have not been seen in Western Europe for 1,000 years, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetic writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Cosimo is so excited by this that he does something extraordinary. He orders his chief scholar, Marsilio Ficino, to stop everything, stop the translation of Plato that Ficino has been working on, stop all other projects, and translate the Corpus Hermeticum first. Plato, the greatest philosopher of ancient Greece, can wait, but these texts apparently cannot. Why the urgency? Standard history says Cosimo was a Renaissance man of enormous intellectual curiosity, and the novelty of the Hermetic texts excited him. This is the standard answer, and it's not wrong. But our story notices something in the margins. Cosimo de' Medici was, according to several alternative historical sources, a member of a Neoplatonic philosophical circle that had connections to older, more secretive traditions of learning. The Medici's banking network spanned the entire Mediterranean, including Egypt and the Levant. They were among the first Europeans to develop significant commercial relationships with the Ottoman Empire after Constantinople's fall in 1453, and Constantinople's libraries had preserved far more of the ancient world's learning than scholars in the Latin West had realized. Was Cosimo an initiate? Was the search for the Corpus Hermeticum not a scholarly adventure, but a deliberate retrieval, part of a coordinated effort by what remained of the mystery network to bring the hidden stream back into the open? Our story says yes, and the effect was extraordinary. The translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, combined with Ficino's subsequent translation of Plato and the Neoplatonists, triggered what historians recognize as the most explosive creative and intellectual transformation in Western history. The Renaissance, not just the art and architecture, though the sacred geometry that the Hermetic tradition preserved shows up unmistakably in Brunelleschi's dome, in Leonardo's notebooks, in the proportional systems of the great Renaissance paintings. More than the art, look at what happens to human consciousness in Renaissance Florence. The rediscovery of the idea that the divine and the human are continuous, that the cosmos is alive and intelligent, that human beings are not fallen creatures in need of redemption, but divine sparks capable of direct knowledge of ultimate reality. These ideas transform everything. They are the philosophical foundation of the scientific revolution that follows. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton. Kepler is particularly interesting. Johannes Kepler, who discovered the laws of planetary motion, who established that planets move in ellipses, not circles, and that there is a precise mathematical relationship between a planet's orbital period and its distance from the Sun, was openly, explicitly, unashamedly a Neoplatonist and Hermetic philosopher. He called his great work the harmonics of the world. He believed that the mathematical patterns he was discovering were the audible, or rather conceptually perceivable, music of the divine intellect, the cosmic mind thinking itself. In our alternative history, Kepler was closer to the truth than even he realized. The mathematical patterns underlying physical reality are not simply the laws of physics. They are the structural expression of the divine realm's influence on the mortal world. The sacred geometry that the Egyptian proto-gods embedded in the pyramids and temples, the proportional systems that the Greek proto-gods embedded in their sacred sites. These are physical expressions of the same underlying mathematics that governs the movement of planets. Kepler, in discovering that mathematics, was reading the divine blueprint. He was, without knowing it, recovering knowledge that had been in the innermost circle of the Alexandrian mysteries all along. But there is a shadow side to the Renaissance retrieval. Just as the Alexandrian project had been vulnerable to the ancient enemy's amplification of human fear and violence, the Roman period persecutions, the Christian takeover, the Renaissance was vulnerable too. The Inquisition, the burning of scholars, mystics, and unconventional thinkers throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, the trial of Galileo, the burning of Giordano Bruno, the centuries of witch trials that targeted exactly the kind of local wisdom keepers who might have preserved fragments of the ancient tradition at the folk level. This is, in our story, exactly the same pattern as the destruction of the Serapeum. Fear, certainty, violence directed specifically at the nodes of the hidden stream. Bruno is perhaps the clearest case. Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in 1600, was not simply a scientist or a philosopher in the modern sense. He was an explicitly Hermetic magician who claimed to practice an art of memory, a technique for restructuring consciousness that had clear Alexandrian roots. He believed in an infinite universe of infinite worlds, each with its own intelligent life. He believed that the ancient Egyptian religion had preserved truths that Christianity had obscured. He also, in our story, had access to fragments of the innermost circle's knowledge, not the full picture, but enough to make him genuinely dangerous to the forces that the ancient enemy was working through. They burned him, but they could not burn everything. The stream flowed on, underground again, into the currents that would eventually produce Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and the Hermetic philosophies that quietly inform the thinking of many of the founding figures of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Newton's unpublished writings, released only in the 20th century, reveal that he spent as much time on alchemy and biblical prophecy as he did on physics. He was searching for a unified theory of reality that integrated the physical laws he was discovering with a hidden theology he believed had been known to the ancients and deliberately concealed. He was right that there was something hidden. He got further in recovering it than almost any Western thinker between the Alexandrian period and the modern era. But he didn't get all the way. And now the precessional window that the Alexandrian scholars had calculated, the critical period when the membrane between realms would be at its thinnest in 12,000 years, is not centuries away. It is now. Let me tell you some things about the modern world that fit very uncomfortably into the standard narrative of secular progress. In 1991, a team of Egyptian archaeologists working under the ancient city of Alexandria found a network of catacombs that extended far deeper and farther than anything previously documented. The network connected directly to the area beneath what was once the Serapeum. The excavations were halted, officially due to budget constraints and the technical difficulty of working in the waterlogged substrate of Alexandria's bedrock. The site remains largely unexcavated. The full extent of what is down there is unknown. In 2008, Egyptian authorities announced that a team using ground-penetrating radar had detected large anomalous chambers beneath the Great Pyramid at Giza, chambers that do not appear on any official architectural survey. The announcement generated brief international media interest, then was quietly dropped. No follow-up investigation has been publicly announced. In 2017, researchers from multiple international institutions published findings from a project called the Scan Pyramids Mission, using cosmic ray imaging to look inside the Great Pyramid non-invasively. They found a large void, roughly 30 meters long, above the Grand Gallery. It does not correspond to any known architectural feature of the pyramid. Its purpose is unknown. As of this writing, it has not been excavated or further investigated. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented facts, reported in peer-reviewed journals and major news outlets. The pyramids contain spaces we have not explored. Under Alexandria, there are tunnels and chambers we have not fully mapped. The physical infrastructure of the ancient world is considerably more extensive and more mysterious than the textbooks suggest. In our alternative history, and here is where the fantasy truly becomes alternate present, this physical infrastructure is still active. The chambers beneath the Serapeum still exist. The passages connecting them to the oldest levels of the pyramid complex, running under the Nile Delta in tunnels built with the same sacred geometry as the surface structures, still exist. Alexander's mummy, or rather, the physical anchor that maintains his preserved consciousness in the space between realms, is still there. The most important scrolls, written on materials more durable than papyrus, in languages more precise than Greek or Egyptian, are still there. And the proto-gods, the remnants of both divine factions, now so weakened by millennia of insufficient worship and damaged infrastructure that they barely qualify as the powerful beings they once were, are still there too, changed, diminished, waiting. They have been waiting since 391 AD, when the last temple burned, waiting for the processional window, waiting for the moment when the membrane between realms thins enough to allow the convergence to finally be completed. According to the calculations of the Alexandrian Mystery School scholars, calculations that have been confirmed in fragments by separate mathematical traditions in Mayan astronomy, in Hindu cosmological cycles, in the Yuga system, that moment falls within a window of approximately 2 to 3 centuries, centered on our current era. We are in the window, now. The ancient enemy knows this too, and for the past century, the pattern of destruction that our story has been tracking, the fear amplification, the targeting of wisdom keepers, the systematic undermining of anything that reconnects human beings to a deeper understanding of reality, has accelerated dramatically. 2 world wars. The Holocaust, a deliberate attempt to destroy the Jewish communities, that had preserved the most intact fragments of the ancient Kabbalistic tradition, which is one of the hidden streams that traces back to the Alexandrian mystery network. The Soviet destruction of religious traditions throughout Central Asia, the Cultural Revolution in China, the Taliban's destruction of ancient Buddhist monuments in Afghanistan, ISIS destroying ancient Assyrian and Mesopotamian artifacts. Every one of these events, our story suggests, follows the same pattern: terror, certainty, directed specifically at the nodes of ancient wisdom, the keepers of old knowledge, the physical artifacts that connect the modern world to its pre-modern inheritance. The ancient enemy is clearing the field, but it hasn't won, not yet, because the mystery network, or what it has become in the modern world, is also active, and it has resources that the ancient Alexandrian scholars could never have imagined. For the first time in human history, every fragment of every ancient text that has survived is being digitized, translated, cross-referenced, and made available to anyone with a basic internet connection. For the first time, people in Alexandria and Athens and Rome and Cairo can read the same texts simultaneously, compare notes in real time, identify patterns that no single scholar working in isolation could ever see. The dispersed streams of the hidden tradition are finding each other again, not in the underground chambers where the mystery schools once met, in open digital space, in the conversations of scholars and researchers and curious individuals who have no idea that they are collectively reassembling a picture that was deliberately fragmented 2,000 years ago. The sacred geometry of the Egyptian temples is being precisely documented by modern survey teams with instruments of unimaginable accuracy. The astronomical alignments of ancient sites worldwide are being cataloged and analyzed. The mathematical patterns in ancient religious symbolism, the patterns that Kepler glimpsed and Newton chased, are being processed by computers capable of handling the complexity that was always just beyond human reach. And underground, in the chambers beneath Alexandria that the archaeologists haven't finished mapping yet, something stirs, not the ancient enemy, something else, something that has been waiting for exactly this moment. In our alternative history, there is a moment, and our story places it in the very near future, when a team of archaeologists working beneath Alexandria finds what they're not supposed to find, not the scrolls, not yet. First, they find a chamber that doesn't appear on any survey. It is perfectly sealed. The stone is a type that does not occur naturally in Egypt or anywhere else in the known geological record. It has been precisely cut to tolerances that modern machining would struggle to match. The joins between the stones are so tight that no tool can be inserted between them. On the exterior, there are inscriptions, in Greek, in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and in a third script that no living scholar can identify. The Greek text says, "He who was one and became two and will be one again." The Egyptian hieroglyphics say, in rough translation, "The bridge between the divine house of the sky and the divine house of the sun rests here until the door opens." The unknown script, which will eventually, after months of computational analysis, be partially decoded as a mathematical language, a notation system rather than a spoken language, describes what our story calls the convergence formula, the mathematical expression of the process by which two distinct divine frequencies can be harmonized into a single, unified force, powerful enough to seal the breach in the dimensional boundary that the ancient enemy has been slowly widening. Inside the chamber, after weeks of careful work to open it without damaging its contents, the archaeologists find the following: a sarcophagus of the same impossible stone. Inside, a figure, preserved beyond any natural process, not mummified in the Egyptian style. The organs are not removed, the body is not desiccated. The figure looks as if it simply went to sleep and has been sleeping for 2,300 years. In one hand, a coin. One side shows Alexander's profile, the other shows the face of Serapis. Around the neck, an amulet. The amulet bears a symbol that will become very familiar to anyone who begins researching this discovery. It is a circle divided into two halves. One half contains a simplified representation of the Olympian pantheon. The other half contains a simplified representation of the Egyptian pantheon. But the halves are mirror images of each other, separated by a line that, upon examination with high-resolution imaging, is not a line at all, but a text, written in that same unknown mathematical script, at a size that requires magnification to read. The text is a name, not Alexander's Greek name, not the Egyptian name the Siwa oracle gave him, a third name, the name the proto-gods gave him in the dimensional space between realms. The name he was given when his preserved consciousness was anchored in the chamber, and he became what our story has been calling him, the bridge. When that name is spoken aloud in the chamber by someone who has correctly decoded the mathematical script and understands its phonological values, something happens. The membrane between realms, which has been slowly thinning for decades as the precessional window approaches, tears, not catastrophically, not the way the ancient enemy would tear it, in violence and dissolution, but gently, precisely, in one very small location, like a needle passing through silk. Through that tear, not the ancient enemy, but the two weakened, exhausted, barely coherent divine factions finally make contact with each other after 2,000 years of separation. And Alexander, or the consciousness that he became, becomes active again. He is the interface, the translator, the being who knows both divine languages perfectly and can hold the conversation that neither faction could hold directly. He speaks to the Greek proto-gods in their frequency. He speaks to the Egyptian proto-gods in their frequency. And for the first time since the destruction of the Serapeum, both groups are in the same conversation. What do they say to each other? In our story, the conversation is not what anyone expected. The Greek proto-gods say, "We thought you had abandoned us." The Egyptian proto-gods say, "We thought you had forgotten the agreement." And Alexander says, "Neither of you abandoned each other. You were separated. There is a difference." It is a small scene, almost domestic in its emotional register, the reunion of two estranged families who have both been isolated so long they've forgotten what they were fighting for. But in the context of a war between cosmic forces that has been ongoing for 12,000 years, it is the most significant thing that has happened since the founding of Alexandria. The convergence begins, not all at once, not with trumpets and visible miracles and gods walking in the streets. Too much damage has been done over 2,000 years. Too many sacred nodes have been destroyed. Too many initiates have died without passing on their knowledge. The convergence has to be rebuilt, piece by piece, using what remains. But it begins. And underground, in the space below the mortal world, where the ancient enemy has been growing stronger for millennia, something changes. The dissolution force, the primordial chaos that both the Greeks and the Egyptians had been fighting from the beginning, feels it. It feels the convergence beginning, and it responds, not with fear. Ancient enemies don't feel fear, they feel appetite, purpose, direction. The ancient enemy turns toward the source of the disturbance in the way that a blind creature turns toward a sound, and it begins to move. Here is the question at the heart of everything we've built. If the Greek gods and the Egyptian gods were both real, if the proto-gods were genuine beings with genuine power, and if the ancient enemy was a genuine cosmic force, then what does the final convergence actually look like? Not metaphorically, not theologically. What does it look like on the ground, in the physical world? Our story answers this question in terms that are deliberately designed to be simultaneously mythological and mundane, because that is the nature of the convergence as our story understands it. The divine and the mortal are not separate categories. They never were. The membrane between realms is not a wall. It is a permeable boundary, and what happens on one side always affects the other. The final convergence, when it comes, looks like this. At 33 sites around the world, the number is not accidental, reflecting the harmonic resonance pattern that was built into Alexandria's founding geometry. Individuals who have been unknowingly acting as nodes of the hidden stream for their entire lives simultaneously experience what psychologists would call a breakthrough event. A philosopher in Athens who has been writing about the connection between Platonic mathematics and quantum physics suddenly understands something about the nature of consciousness that no human being has clearly understood since the innermost circle of the Alexandrian mysteries. A mathematician in Cairo who has been working on prime number patterns discovers that those patterns map precisely onto the architectural proportions of the Giza complex in a way that could not be coincidence. A young woman in a small village in the Nile Delta who has been having vivid dreams about serpents and golden light since childhood wakes up one morning and finds that she can read the mathematical script on the underground chamber's inscriptions as easily as her native Arabic. These 33 individuals do not know each other. They have never heard of the Mystery Network or the Divine Convergence Project. They are ordinary people who happen to have been, throughout their lives, particularly attentive to a certain frequency, the frequency that the proto-gods have been broadcasting, weakly but persistently, since their exile from the mortal world. They begin to find each other, online mostly, in academic papers that cross-reference unexpectedly, in dreams that turn out to be shared, in small, improbable coincidences that multiply until they become too numerous to dismiss. And as they find each other, as the network begins to form in the mortal world, mirroring the convergence that is already happening in the divine dimension, the membrane becomes visibly thinner, not metaphorically, physically. In certain places, the spaces where the sacred nodes still exist, where the architectural anchors are intact, where the harmonic resonance of the divine grid is strongest, light begins to behave strangely. Instruments in physics laboratories near Giza record electromagnetic anomalies that correspond to no known phenomenon. The mathematical patterns in nature, the Fibonacci spirals in shells and flowers, the fractal geometry of coastlines and cloud formations, the prime number patterns in cicada life cycles, all of these begin to shift, subtly, barely measurably, but measurably, as if the universe is holding its breath. And in the underground chamber beneath Alexandria, Alexander begins to speak. Not physically. His preserved body remains as still as it has been for 2,300 years. But through the thin place in the membrane, his consciousness, held in the space between realms, makes contact with the 33 individuals of the modern network. Not in words, in images, in mathematical intuitions, in the precise emotional quality of knowing something that cannot be fully articulated. He tells them what he learned at Siwa. He tells them the true name of the ancient enemy, not its individual name, because it is not an individual, but the category of its being, the name for the principle of dissolution, the sound that, when spoken correctly, is not a word, but a mathematical constant, a specific frequency at which the membrane resonates against the ancient enemy's pressure, pushing it back. The Egyptian proto-gods had encoded this frequency in the daily ritual of Ra's battle with Apophis. The Greek proto-gods had encoded it in the mathematical proportions of their sacred architecture. The two encodings were complementary. Neither one alone was sufficient. Together, they form the complete formula, the convergence formula that was written in that mathematical script on the amulet around Alexander's neck. The 33 individuals begin to work, not as magicians or priests. They wouldn't know how to be those things even if they tried. They work as what they are: a philosopher, a mathematician, an ordinary young woman who can read an impossible script, a physicist, a computer programmer, an architect, an archaeologist, a musician who has been composing melodies that, she only now realizes, are direct translations of mathematical constants into auditory form. They work for 3 years. In the world of our story, these are the 3 years in which everything seems to get worse before it gets better. The ancient enemy, feeling the convergence building, amplifies its interference. Fear rises, conflict increases. Every institution that the hidden stream has managed to embed itself in comes under pressure, but the 33 hold. At the culmination, on a date that corresponds to a precise precessional alignment, a moment when the Earth's axis points in a direction it has not pointed since the last great thinning of the membrane 12,000 years ago. The convergence formula is spoken, not in any one location. Simultaneously, at all 33 nodes, each individual speaking the portion of the formula that their work has recovered. Together, they form a complete statement in the mathematical language of the divine dimension, addressed to both the Greek proto-gods and the Egyptian proto-gods simultaneously. It says, in the deepest possible translation, "You were one thing once, be one thing again." The answer comes from both directions at once, and the ancient enemy, the primordial chaos force that has been the mortal enemy of everything living and structured and meaningful since before human history began, does not die. Our story, which has been consistent about the impossibility of permanently destroying this force, does not cheat at the end. But the membrane, strengthened by the convergence, closes, seals in the way that a wound seals, not gone. The scar remains, but closed. Apophis, pressing against the barrier, finds that it holds. Typhon, coiling in the depths of Tartarus, finds the walls of his prison reinforced. And Ra, in whatever diminished, barely coherent form the ancient sun god still exists, rises in the morning for the first time in 2,000 years without having to fight alone. He has help. What does the world look like in our story after the convergence is completed? It does not look like a fantasy epic's triumphant ending. No gods walking in golden light, No magical transformation of human civilization overnight. The real world is not so easily changed, and our story has been too carefully built on genuine historical and mythological foundations to abandon that realism at the finish line. The world after the convergence looks, from the outside, mostly the same. The wars are still happening. The environmental crises are still severe. The inequality, the injustice, the suffering, all of that persists. The convergence has not solved human problems. It has done something more subtle and more fundamental. It has changed the background frequency. The membrane, now sealed against the ancient enemy's pressure, no longer amplifies the worst impulses of human psychology. The fear frequency, the dissolution tendency, the historical pattern of violence directed specifically at wisdom and knowledge and connection. This does not disappear. It is part of human nature and human society. But it no longer has the cosmic wind at its back. It is merely human now, and human beings, when they are not being amplified by a force of primordial chaos, are remarkably resilient. The 33 individuals, their work complete, go back to their lives. The philosopher returns to her office in Athens. The mathematician takes a long walk along the Nile. The young woman in the Delta village sits in her garden and watches the sunset and finds that the dreams of serpents have stopped. Not because the serpent is gone, but because she is no longer needed as a receiver. The transmission has been received. In the underground chamber beneath Alexandria, Alexander's preserved form remains. The chamber will eventually be opened by archaeologists, in perhaps another decade, perhaps longer. When it is opened, the world will have to confront something that does not fit into any existing framework for understanding history or reality or the nature of consciousness. What will we do with that confrontation? Our story doesn't answer this question, because the story, at this point, becomes our story, the one that is actually happening, the one that we are actually living. The most honest thing our alternative history can do at this juncture is stop being history and become a question. What if everything we've described is a metaphor, but a metaphor that contains more truth than most straightforward statements? What if the proto-gods are not literal beings, but categories of human experience, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of civilization compressed into divine forms, because that is the only form large enough to hold them? What if the ancient enemy is not a literal creature, but the name for what happens to human societies when they forget where they came from, when they cut the connections to the accumulated wisdom of the past, when fear wins and knowledge burns? What if Alexandria, and what it represented, was never really destroyed? What if the most important thing the Mystery Network ever did was not to preserve knowledge in secret chambers, but to embed it so deeply in the fabric of human creativity and inquiry that no amount of burning could touch it? What if it's in the mathematics, in the music, in the ratios of beauty that make us stop and catch our breath in front of a great painting or a great building or a great theorem? What if the convergence has been happening all along in the slow, patient, unstoppable process by which human beings keep seeking truth even when every institution around them tells them to stop? Let's come back to the beginning. You are standing in Alexandria. The air smells of salt water and burning cedar and something older. But this time, you know what that smell is. It is the smell of the threshold, the place where two worlds press against each other, the membrane between what is and what could be, between the world that fear would make and the world that knowledge and courage and the long, patient work of understanding might still bring into being. Alexander stands beside you, not the 25-year-old conqueror on a white horse, though he is that too, somewhere, in the endless record that time keeps of every moment that ever mattered. He is something more now, something that death and time and the impossible task of being the bridge between two warring divine traditions has made of him. He is still afraid. This is the most important thing about him, and the most human thing, and the thing our story most wants you to remember. He was always afraid of the light in the desert that he couldn't name, afraid of what the oracle at Siwa would tell him, afraid of the responsibility that he hadn't asked for and couldn't put down. Every conqueror is afraid. That's why they conquer, in the desperate hope that moving fast enough will outrun the fear. But he kept moving toward the thing he was afraid of, not despite the fear, with it, carrying it. That is what the convergence looks like when it happens at the human scale, not gods merging in golden light, a person walking toward the thing that frightens them most, a philosopher following a line of reasoning to its most uncomfortable conclusion, a mathematician trusting the pattern even when it leads somewhere no one has been before, a young woman deciding that a dream is worth paying attention to even when everyone around her says she's foolish. The great migration of gods is not a story about gods. It is a story about us, about the civilization we have been building for 12,000 years, about the knowledge we have preserved and the knowledge we have burned and the knowledge that refuses, stubbornly, impossibly, to stay buried. The sand of Egypt holds secrets. Modern Alexandria sits on a city that has been building and burning and rebuilding since before recorded history. Under every stone, another stone. Under every truth, another truth. The membrane between what we know and what we might know is thinner than it has ever been, and getting thinner every year. What will we find when it tears? That is the question our story ends on. Not, will the gods return? Not, will the ancient enemy be defeated? But, what will we do when the boundary between the known and the unknown finally gives way? Will we be afraid and call it heresy and burn it? Or will we walk toward it, carrying our fear like Alexander carried his, and find out what's on the other side? History, the real history, the one that the sand still holds, is still being written. The pen is in your hands.